Hello, my name is Einat Wilf. I was born and raised in Israel. For the past few years, I've been working as a kind of roving ambassador, working with pro-Israel organizations around the world to tell the story of Israel and Zionism. Before that, I was a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, for a few years, where I served on the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee and as chair of the Education Committee. The definition of Zionism, quite simply, is the political movement for liberation of the Jewish people and self-determination in their homeland. It's a very straightforward definition, but one that is remarkably unknown and forgotten. I grew up in Israel in a very Zionist home. I took Zionism for granted in many ways. It was a natural part of my identity. But I became more committed to telling the story of Zionism, to writing about it around the world, when I began to realize quite a few years ago that whereas I described myself quite naturally and casually as a Zionist, I realized that increasingly for many people they cringed when I mentioned the word, that somehow the word had become toxic, that no self-respecting person would define themselves as a Zionist. And that's when I began to realize that, especially around the world, our story has been hijacked, disfigured, trampled upon, and turned into something awful. And I realized that we need to take back our story. And this is something that was very important to me, and I have dedicated myself to it ever since. We need to understand why Zionism and the word Zionism has become so toxic. For me, there was a realization that this was not something accidental. Initially, the tendency is to say, oh, the word has become toxic because Israel has been pursuing awful policies, it's the occupation, it's settlements, and this is why Zionism has become such a bad word. But I realized when I met people and spoke to them that there was something far more sinister going on. And what I realized at one point is that this was purposeful. There was an ongoing campaign that in many ways has been going on for decades. It started with the Arab world as soon as Israel was established. It became part of the Soviet policy for much of the 70s and 80s, culminating in the Zionism racism decision or kind of resolution in the United Nations, a very shameful moment. And ever since the fall of the Soviet Union has become part of left-wing circles, initially in Europe and increasingly in the United States. And the way that this process has been working is by something I call the placard strategy. The placard strategy is something you would recognize from placards that are raised in all anti-Israel demonstrations. They say Israel, Zionism, sometimes they just settle for the Star of David, equals. And it somehow never says Zionism equals the political movement for liberation and self-determination of the Jewish people in their homeland. I mean, this placard strategy has basically equated Zionism with all that is evil in our world. What you find on the other side of the equation is colonialism, imperialism, racism, apartheid, even genocide, Nazism. And those words are carefully chosen, not because they bear any relation to reality, they don't, but because they connote evil. And essentially what the strategy does is to give people the ongoing refrain that Zionism, Israel, the Star of David, equal evil. And it is quite a sinister policy that has nothing to do with the actual Israel, with actual Israel policies. What it tries to create is a global notion that there's evil out there. And in that sense, it creates a mental situation which then is an invitation to violence. Because if you tell people that there's an evil out there, then they will do anything they can to eradicate this evil, even use violence. At the very source of the conflict between Zionism and the Arabs with respect to the land what we call the land of Israel, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, what they have come to call Palestine. At the source of it is the claim that the other side basically has no rights to that land. And each side in that service brings a lot of arguments, and good arguments. We were here first, it's our tradition, it's our history, it's our God, essentially negating that of the other. And what we are seeing in the battle that is waged against Israel in the placard strategy is an effort to make it clear that the Jewish people have absolutely no right whatsoever to the land. The claim is made that first, the Jewish people are not a people at all. You hear that often said, the Jewish people, it's only a religion. Judaism is only a religion. I myself am not a religious person. Many Jews are not. To argue that Judaism is only a religion is, first of all, wrong and offensive to people who are not religious. Judaism is first and foremost about a sense of being a people, a solidarity with your people, and then some people are of faith, are believers, and some are not. And the second element of the battle against Israel and Zionism is to argue that not only are the Jewish people not a people, and therefore have no right to self-determination, but that their entire notion that they have rights to this land, that they have a connection to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, that's invented. And it's quite remarkable because it's one of the best documented relationships between a people and a land. It's between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. It is both a relationship that exists in presence. There has been continuous Jewish presence from the earlier times of Israelite and Judean sovereignty in the land. And even once the Judeans, later to be called the Jews, went into exile by the Roman Empire, they continued to yearn in prayer, in ritual, and practice for their return to the land of Israel. In many ways, a lot of analysts argue that the Jewish people remained a people, a separate people, for the single purpose of one day returning to the land of Israel. So it's a very long and documented history. And to deny that is part of the battle that takes place against Zionism in order to present it as a movement of foreigners, as a movement of colonialists, as people, foreign people who have come to take a foreign land, and therefore should be essentially thrown out because they have no right to be here. And the battle that we have is to make it clear to those around us, to the Arab world, to the Palestinians, to the Muslim world in general, that we have come home. We are not strangers. We are not foreigners. I believe that this does not mean that our right to the land is exclusive or superior. I very much believe that the Arabs have the right to self-determination in the land. But their right is not exclusive or superior either, which is what they claim. So we are an indigenous people of the land who have returned to the land, who have never broken their connection to the land, and we have returned home. Now, I do think it's important to understand that what we're asking the Arabs to accept is a tall order. I believe that Zionism is one of the world's most inspiring ideas. It's an inspirational movement. A small people, persecuted, marginalized, founded within themselves the energy, the vision to rise up, to reclaim their homeland, and to be sovereign again, and to build a remarkable country. That's an inspirational story for all oppressed people everywhere. That you could be dealt the worst cards in history and still not let that be your destiny. Not let victimhood be the end of your story. So it's inspiring. But I often joke that there's a fine line between inspiring and insane. And it's an insane idea. I mean, who comes home after 2,000 years, right? It's a crazy idea. So we're asking the Arabs to accept that a people have come home after 2,000 years. And not any people, the Jews. who in their view, in their history, in their theology, were subhumans who were supposed to be relegated to the dustbin of history, certainly not come back as triumphant, powerful people. So we need to understand from their perspective, in many ways, the only way to make sense of it is to just kind of ignore all of that and say, oh, these are just colonialists. This is not theirs. They're foreigners. It's a imperialist conspiracy. Because to really accept that the Jewish people have come back from history and have come home, that's quite the challenge. It's inspiring, but it also means that this conflict is going to last for a while because we're asking the other side to really accept a lot. Zionism is by definition a progressive idea. Zionism was born of the Enlightenment, and it embodies the ideas of the Enlightenment. If you want to understand all of human history in terms of what is progressive and modern and what is pre-modern, is that in pre-modern societies, if you were different, it meant you were destined to be unequal. Modernity, for a few hundred years now, is about a revolution in human affairs, whereas the fact that you're different doesn't give anyone the right to treat you unequally. Now, that's a very revolutionary idea, and we're still working on how to do it in our lives today. It's been a few hundred years now, and it's not simple. And every day we continue to expand the notion of what kind of difference should not give anyone the right to treat you unequally. And it's one of the reasons, of course, feminism, liberalism, a lot of these ideas emerge from the Enlightenment, from this basic notion that even though you're different, you cannot be treated unequally. Zionism emerged from the same place. Zionism is essentially the Jews saying, look, we are a nation, we are a people, and at the moment that the entire world is organizing itself into nation states and into peoples, then we too have that equal right. It's a universal equal right of all peoples to self-determination in our land. And our land, where else than the one country, the one land with which we've always been associated. So Zionism is about the Jewish claim to equality. That is the definition of a progressive, enlightened idea. The reason that Zionism has been portrayed as not being that is that we see it even today. When groups who have previously been persecuted, marginalized, subjugated, claim their equality, there's backlash. You see that with feminism, you see that with a lot of other groups. It doesn't just happen easily. In my short years in politics, I've learned something very basic. No one ever gives up power willingly. You essentially have to pry it from their cold, dead hands. So if women are claiming equality with men, how dare they? How crazy is that? Well, it doesn't just go over smoothly. There's backlash, and feminism has been facing backlash from day one and still today. That's why there's an effort to turn feminism also into a toxic word so that women will stop promoting that annoying idea. And Zionism too. Zionism is about the Jewish people having the gall to claim that they are equal. That doesn't go over so easily. So there's a backlash. And the backlash, among other things, is in the effort to paint Zionism as something that is evil, that is illegitimate, that should not exist and does not belong in our world. But it is precisely because Zionism is so progressive, because it comes from the ideas of the Enlightenment, because it is about a previously marginalized people daring to demand their equality, that it faces backlash. Zionism has been critical to one of the greatest successes of the modern state of Israel, which is its ability to assimilate and to create a single nation, a single people from Jews who have come from so many cultures and so many differences. Because on the one hand, what Zionism clearly claimed is that the Jewish people are a people, that we are a single people and a single nation. But when Zionism emerged as a political movement with specific goals and plans at the end of the 19th century, the Jews had already existed for centuries, for millennia, among other peoples. And they mixed in a little, which is why you have blue-eyed Jews and black-eyed Jews and brown and white and all colors. And Jews spoke different languages and had different foods and had a different kind of sense of culture, in as much as there was also their Jewish culture. So when the state of Israel was to be established, when Zionism began to emerge, one of the things that made Zionism unique is that for a modern state of Israel to emerge, people had to immigrate here. There was a small Jewish presence here, but by and large, the vast majority of the Jewish people lived outside the land of Israel. So Zionism is unique among national movements that in order to actually liberate the people, it wasn't enough to just kill a king or something. We actually had to bring the people here, or the people had to bring themselves. So immigration, aliyah, the notion of ascending, is critical to Zionism. Without immigration, Zionism would have remained the crazy lunatic idea of some people in Vienna. But thanks to immigration, thanks to Aliyah, because the idea was so inspirational to people around the world, Jews began immigrating here. And inspired by the Zionist idea, they forged themselves as a nation, as a modern nation. One of the main things they did was to revive the Hebrew language. Until that point, essentially a language of scripture. So think about all these Jews immigrating to Israel. They see Hebrew letters when they come off the boat. They recognize the letters, but it's a language that they haven't spoken. So it's both foreign and familiar. That is an amazing achievement, to renew that language and then make it again the language of the Jewish people, the language of Israel. And just to get a sense of the proportions of immigration, when the state of Israel declared independence from British rule, there were about 600,000 Jews living here. In the next decade, about 1 million Jews immigrated to the new state of Israel, people from displaced persons camps across Europe, in Cyprus, from North Africa and the Arab world, where they were unceremoniously pushed out in revenge for the establishment of the state of Israel. All of these people were absorbed into this society. So 600,000 take in 1 million in the next decade. I think these are unprecedented and unparalleled proportions. And they have all become a people. I sometimes have a little exercise I like to do with young people, soldiers, high school students. I ask them, for those of you born in Israel and whose parents, if not born in Israel, married in Israel, how many have 4 grandparents from the same ethnic background, the same geography? In a room of 200, maybe 3 will raise their hands. So it really gives you a sense of how remarkable this has been. It's one of Israel's greatest success stories. It's true that it's also led to many challenges. Any immigrant country will always have challenges between groups who came earlier and groups who came later, and everyone thinking that they get to set the rules and these new guys shouldn't get to set the rules, and that's very typical of every immigrant society. But I think it's one of the greatest strengths of Israel. It accounts for the diversity and for the energy and for the fact that it's just an interesting society. Immigrant societies are interesting societies, and Zionism has been critical to making the effort to make that happen. I consider myself very much a person of the Israeli left in Israel. On all liberal issues, as you would define them in the West, I'm all the way out there. And with respect to what is considered left in Israel, in terms of supporting Palestinian statehood, supporting a two-state solution for peace, I'm definitely in support and have always been. The only thing that has changed for me over the last few years is a deeper understanding of how broad and serious the conflict is. That it's not just about borders or the occupation or the settlements. That it is still, sadly and fundamentally, about the fact that the Arab world, the Palestinians among them, believe that the Jewish people as a people have absolutely no right to self-determination in the land. And that still is at the core of the conflict. And the conflict will only end, and peace will come, when the Arab world finally recognizes us as their equals, as their equal claimants to their land, as people of equal dignity in this region. Again, not a people with a superior claim to the land, with an exclusivist claim to the land. I personally have no patience for Jewish supremacists, and I have no patience for Arab supremacists. We are not helped by either side claiming that it's only theirs. Ultimately, peace will come when there is recognition that neither side can have it all. As much as they might have a historical, legitimate claim to all of it, neither side can have all of it. The Zionist leadership has been willing to recognize that for quite some time, which is why we accepted partition and have repeatedly agreed and made offers that would establish a Palestinian state. The Palestinian people are not just hapless victims. They are agents of their fate, of their future. And they have made, to date, a conscious decision to reject all forms of partition because in their mind, dividing this land and sharing it with a Jewish sovereignty is an insult. And we need to understand that, and we need to respect that, and we need to understand where that comes from in their theology, in their history. We need to understand why is it so difficult for them to accept that the Jewish people have come home. It is truly something remarkable. So it will take time. But the fact that the conflict is hard, is difficult to resolve, should not blind anyway to the notion that fundamentally Zionism is a progressive idea. It is about the liberation of an oppressed people. It is about these people demanding something, demanding equality, but not more than that, not less than that, but not more than that. And this is also an inspiring story to share with others. There's so much talk of intersectionality in our campuses, and those who are Zionists, pro-Israel, often tell me that they feel they can't participate, and they're sometimes just literally pushed out of progressive, left-wing, liberal causes because somehow being pro-Israel and Zionist means that they cannot truly be a supporter of the oppressed. But we have a remarkable story to share with all these causes, which is this. Yes, you all have a history of oppression, of suffering. We know something about that. But we also know that you can take fate into your own hands. You can shape your future. You can reject your status as a victim and do something about it that actually changes the course of history. You don't just need to be pointing fingers. You can actually rise up and do something that changes your future and gets other people to realize that they need to begin to treat you differently. And we also have another story to tell, which is that when you do that, there will be backlash. Don't expect it to be easy. Don't expect that if you rise up, people will just welcome you as equals. It is going to be a long and hard-fought battle. But this is a remarkable story of progress, of enlightenment, that we can share with all people who have suffered, who have been oppressed. And in that sense, Zionism is not only about the Jews and is not only for the Jews. It is about us in terms of having a state, but it is a universal ideal that can inspire all. To understand the condition of the Arab minority, and it's mostly an Arab Muslim minority within the state of Israel, we first need to understand that Israel is home to one of the largest Muslim minorities in the world, proportionally. France, India, Russia come close proportionally, but Israel has the highest share. Now, It had come to be, of course, because as Jewish people immigrated here, and Arabs as well, but there were many local Arabs, they were less than enthused about Zionism and about the fact that the Jewish people have returned to reclaim their homeland. And over time, this became in conflict between two full-fledged national movements. Now think about the Arabs who have become the citizens of the State of Israel. One day they wake up, a new state has been established. They did not dream of this state in Vienna. They did not want it to come into being. They even fought against it. They fought for it not to become a state. And yet they wake up the next morning and they're citizens of that state. What are they going to do? From that moment, you essentially have two responses that remain to this day and define the relationship. One response says this: okay, it's not what we wanted, it's not what we dreamt of, we didn't want it to be, but it's an okay state. It's a democracy, we have our rights, we are citizens, we can vote, we can be elected. So let's just make sure that our official rights transform into a real sense of belonging. This is what you would call a classic minority struggle. And it is a struggle with which the Jewish majority has had a lot of sympathy and which has led to tremendous achievements. And we should not be blind to that. It is one of the reasons that Arabs within Israel hold the most favorable views of Jews in the entire Arab region. It's still, by comparison, there's not a lot of favorable views of Jews in the Arab world, but the most favorable views are among Israel's Arab citizens. So those are the achievements, and they come from somewhere. But there's also an attitude, and sometimes it's in the same person, that says, actually, we're never going to feel that this is our country, that we belong, unless it ceases to be everything that it was set up to be. It should no longer be committed to Jewish immigration. It should no longer have Hebrew and Jewish symbols in the public sphere. Basically, it should not be anything that is about the liberation and self-determination of the Jewish people. Then we can feel that we belong. When the Jewish majority hears that, they say, no thank you. We did not fight, we did not bleed, we did not sacrifice, so that at the end of the day, the Jewish people don't even have one state that they can call their own. And this has complicated the relationship. I have an Arab colleague who said that if you want to understand Jewish-Arab relations within Israel, you need to understand that the Jews are the numerical majority, but in their minds, they're the minority. And the Arabs are the numerical minority, but in their minds, they're the majority. Now, if you zoom out to the region, it happens to be the case. The Jews are a tiny 6 to 7 million, unwanted, unwelcome minority in what is increasingly an intolerant region, among 400 more million Arabs, 1+ billion Muslims. So that is the situation, of course, in the region. But it's not just about the region, it's about a mental state. The Jews have been a minority for centuries. All their customs, institutions, writings, even I would say their humor, have been adapted to being a minority that depends on the kindness of others, who were mostly not so kind. The Arabs are used to being a majority, 100% majority. The Arabs in Israel are the only Arab minority in the region. That's humiliating from their perspective, especially in a country that was supposed to be 100% Arab if it were not for those pesky Jews who make the crazy claim that they have come home. So this complicates the relationship even further. So I would say that there is much to celebrate in the relationship. Polls show that Arabs within Israel are more and more proud of their Israeli identity, have a relatively more favorable view of Jews compared to Arabs in the region. Still much needs to be done. But sometimes I say when you look at all the complications, when you put it in the context of an ongoing conflict, it's truly remarkable that it's not worse.